Hi guys, welcome to Book Time. My name is Julia. Today I'm going to be doing a video about Australian nature writing that I would like to get to. So currently it is the Springathon Readathon, which I'm doing. So I'll link my TBR video and the videos from the hosts Natalie and Emma down below. It's a really cool idea and it's basically a nature writing readathon. So these books are not my TBR and they're books that I'm probably unlikely to get to during this readathon, but they are nature writing books that I would like to get to at some point. And because of the Springathon, I was feeling inspired to sort of look up nature books that I'd like to get to in the future. So here we go, they're in no particular order. The first one is called Eastern Curlew by Harry Sadler, who's an Australian writer. So the Eastern Curlew, I don't know if you call it a native Australian bird, but it certainly migrates from the Arctic to Australia. And this book is essentially about that migration journey and about the bird. And apparently it's really beautifully written and I would love to get to it. It's out through a Fern Press. The next one I'd love to get to is Where Song Began by Tim Lowe. And this is a book that's actually about the significance and history of Australian songbirds. It sounds really interesting because apparently, according to the blurb on the book, Australian songbirds are more aggressive and more noisier, more social and more mobile than other songbirds around the world. So they have migrated around the world, and a lot of species of songbird around the world are due to the fact that Australian songbirds, a long time ago, obviously, spread around the world. So that's really cool. It also talks about the fact that the reason that wasn't known until recently was because it wasn't until 2004 that it was accepted scientifically that songbirds from the southern hemisphere could survive in the northern hemisphere. So that's pretty interesting that that was only proven scientifically or accepted in the scientific community in 2004, and the author makes the case that that's because most ornithologists are actually from the northern hemisphere and not from the southern hemisphere. Anyway, I've been meaning to get to it since it came out in 2014, and that one is out through Penguin. The next one I want to get to is by Penny Olsen and Lynette Russell, and it's called Australia's First Naturalists. And it's published by the National Library of Australia, and it's actually, so these two authors have pieced together all the historical evidence demonstrating the input that Australian First Nations peoples had on early zoological accounts made by colonial settlers, if that makes sense. So I'm going to read again, just going to read from the blurb because it's more articulate than I can be. As silent partners, Aboriginal Australians gave Europeans their first views of iconic animals such as the koala, the lyrebird, helped unravel the mystery of the egg-laying mammals, the echidna and the platypus. Well into the 20th century, Indigenous people were routinely engaged by collectors, illustrators and others with an interest in Australia's animals, yet this participation, if admitted at all, was generally barely acknowledged. However, the authors have found that obviously by looking at the documents, their input was hugely significant. It's always going to be problematic, and there's a tension because it's reading about how Indigenous people contributed to a body of knowledge that in many ways was then directly used to suppress them. So European science was used to do all sorts of things like separate Aboriginal children from their families and other terrible things. So yeah, there's like a weird problematic tension that the book is maybe celebrating that. But I think it's also important to go, well, this happened and their involvement has not been documented till now, and it would be good to read how they have actually influenced a knowledge of Australian flora and fauna. The next one I've got down is actually a little middle grade one. I think it's a middle grade fiction or maybe junior fiction. It's a really little novel called Black Cockatoo. The authors are, got my notes, Carl Merrison and Hakea Hustler. So Carl Merrison is an Indigenous writer. And this is about Mia, an Aboriginal girl who rescues a black cockatoo, and I think her relationship with the cockatoo helps her sort of discover some things about herself, and it just sounds like a really nice story, so I look forward to get to that at some point. The next one I've got is actually this big hardcover that I own, On the Trail of the Silver Brumby. It's out through HarperCollins. So if you don't know, Brumby is the word for a wild horse in Australia. So they're not native, they're introduced species, but they have become wild since their introduction around Australia, but primarily in the Australian Alps and the Australian high country, so which are in New South Wales and northern Victoria. So this Elyne, I don't know how to pronounce her name, so if you do, please let me know. I think it's Elyne or Elyne Mitchell. She was actually the author of the Silver Brumby series, which I have many books on. Children's novels, which I adored as a kid. So they're about Flora, who is a silver Palomino Brumby, and his herd of horses, or how he's born and grows up and all the adventures they go on. I loved it. They were so, like, these are actually really good nature writing too, if you like middle grade fiction. The Silver Brumby series, there's such beautiful descriptions of the mountains and the peaks and the valleys and the tors and the caves and the high plains, and oh, it's so good. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about them. I read them so many times as a kid. But this book is actually about the author, and I think it's written by her kids or her nephew or something, and it's basically just about the mountains where she lived. So it's the history of her family. I'm going to put some cutaways of the pictures because there's really beautiful pictures of the mountains and the snow and all the hiking and skiing they did. So this writer also wrote a bunch of non-fiction books about the Australian Alps, which are really hard to find. They're not in print anymore, but they'll probably be at my uni library, which is closed at the moment due to lockdown, but at some point I'll get to them. This also includes a lot of her own non-fiction writing and poetry about the mountains and the landscape. So I just think this is a gorgeous book, and I do flick through it from time to time, but I really would like to make the effort to read it properly at some point, like go through it front to back, because it's really gorgeous. The next couple that I have are also books that I own. So the first one is, I've actually started reading this before I got about a third of the way through. This is Journeys to the Interior by Nicolas Rothwell, out through Black Ink, an Australian indie press. Nicolas Rothwell is a really interesting guy. He's politically quite conservative, but he lives up north in the Northern Territory. Writes a lot about nature, really. He's written some novels as well. And he's got a bit of a reputation for writing sort of overly descriptive purple prose. And it is pretty descriptive, but I like it. The reason he's interesting is because he can come under fire from left-wing critics, I suppose, and I myself am quite left-wing. But because he's politically conservative, he gets criticised by the left-wing. However, particularly when it comes to things like Indigenous rights, that said, he is actually living up north and has really strong relationships with the Indigenous community up there. He's really connected with the Indigenous art community. He's actually done a lot of really good work and has the real relationships that probably a lot of the armchair critics, left-wing armchair critics in inner city Melbourne don't have. So yeah, it's just interesting to sort of read about him, the dialogue that goes on around him getting criticised, but then I'm like, well, sure, maybe politically I differ, but he's the one who actually probably has a great deal more knowledge about Indigenous culture than I do. Anyway, so this book is about nature, but it's also portraits of different people from the north. So, as in writing portraits. So let me just tell you, he's written about a lot of people, and many of them are Indigenous, and a lot of them are artists. And there's also descriptions of members of the Yunupingu family who are all quite well-known artists and musicians. Who are from northeast Arnhem Land. He's also got secret sections on sand hills, the silent landscapes, snakes. It's just, I remember feeling this was like very meditative and descriptive and slow going, and it sort of incorporates descriptions like these portraits of these different people from up north who live in the north, different artists and different people who work with the land in different ways. And I liked it. So, well, I liked the bit I got to, so I would like to finish it. I have read another one of his novels, which I think I liked. I can't really remember, it was a long time ago, but I don't remember it being as based on nature as this one. So if you want to read about Australia's one perspective on Australia's Northern Territory landscape, and a lot of people who live there. This might be one for you to read. Another one that I've got that I haven't read, it's a novel. It's Carpentaria by Alexis Wright, which is out through Giramondo. It won the Miles Franklin Award in 2007. I actually tried to buddy read this with 3 other friends, and we all stopped, not because we didn't like it, but because it's incredibly dense, and none of us were in a good headspace to read that type of prose. It's also obviously very long. But the first, so it's actually a story. Carpentaria is an epic of the Gulf country of northwestern Queensland, which is northwestern Australia. It's the portrait of the precariously settled Desperance, that's a town, and the powerful Phantom family, leader of the West End Pricklebush people, and its battles with old Joseph Midnight's renegade East End mob on the one hand and the white officials on the other. So it's about a long-standing battle between Indigenous group and white people, and set in Gulf of Carpentaria. And the descriptions were just these incredibly long descriptions of nature, and it was really beautiful, but really dense and intense. So the first few pages are all about, the ancestral serpent, a creature larger than storm clouds, came down from the stars laden with its own creative enormity. It moved graciously. If you'd been watching with the eyes of a bird hovering in the sky, looking down at the serpent's wet body, glistening from the ancient sunlight, long before man was a creature who can contemplate the next moment in time. It's pretty epic, and very powerful and beautiful. And I would love to get to it when I have, I just want to make sure I can actually dedicate the sort of headspace needed for something like this. But if you've read it, let me know. I should mention Alexis Wright is an Indigenous writer. She is a member of the Wanya Nation of the Southern Highlands of the Gulf of Carpentaria, so it's about where she's from. I got more. The next one I want to talk about is The Call of the Reed Warbler by Charles Massy, which is basically a book about farming and agriculture, but in a way changing to a sustainable way of farming that really works well with the landscape and with soil. And I don't know if it's similar to Wilding by Isabella Tree, but it kind of gave me similar vibes. So this guy, Charles Massy, he has various science degrees, I think in zoology and some other things. He also used to be a chemical heavy farmer, but now has basically completely regenerated the land that he farms. I think possibly for more farming, but in a really natural and sustainable way. And I'm really excited to read about it because I loved reading about that type of thing in Wilding, but that was obviously in a British context, and to read about it in an Australian context would be super interesting because that's where I'm from. I'm also really excited to get to this book called Kindred, a Cradle Mountain love story. And let me tell you the authors, I don't have them written down here. The author's name is Kate Legge. This sounds so cool. It's out through Melbourne University Press. Oh, I should say The Call of the Reed Warbler was out through UQP. So this one's out through Melbourne Uni Press. And I think it's basically the tale. So Cradle Mountain is a mountain as part of a range and sort of, I don't know if it's national park, but certainly protected World Heritage Area in Tasmania, our most southern state, which is also an island. Very beautiful. And this is the story of the 2 people who were hikers in the early 20th century, maybe 1910, and they hiked Cradle Mountain and they loved it so much. So she was Australian and had grown up in Tassie, and he was a migrant from Austria, but they both loved nature. And I think their dream when they climbed this mountain was to create a sanctuary and protect it basically from development because it was so beautiful. And I think this is the story of how they fought to achieve that during their lifetimes. And I have a feeling they didn't actually get it as protected as they would have liked, but now, even though they've since died, it has achieved World Heritage status and is really beautiful. So I'm really excited to read that because Tassie is one of my favourite places. It's so beautiful, and I would just love to read more about the history of, how some of its landscape has become protected. The last one I want to talk about, I think it's the last one anyway, is Inga Simpson. So she has written mostly novels, I think, but the one, and they're all, she's an Australian author and she is known for writing about nature. The one I'm most interested in is called Understory, A Life with Trees. And she's from Queensland, which is in the north. And I think in this book, each chapter focuses on a different tree from the Queensland hinterland, or the Sunshine Coast hinterland, which is where she's from. And then uses information, like scientific information, anecdotal information, and stuff to talk about the tree, but also uses that to kind of illuminate aspects of her life and how nature has shaped her. It sounds really, really cool. And I've heard good things about it from other people and book reviewers that I respect. Obviously, there is probably so many more. I've got such fuzzy hair today. So many more books about nature in Australia that I would love to get to. But these are just the ones that I've sort of had noticed around reading and watching blogs and stuff. So yeah, if you've got other recommendations, let me know. I would love to hear them. Also, if you're participating in Springathon, please let me know so I can watch any videos you're doing about them. Or if you're not a booktuber, just tell me what you're reading. All right, thanks guys, bye.